Going over grandmaster games is one of the best ways of improving, but sometimes it's a little hard to tell exactly what's going on, especially if you're like a beginner or intermediate player. So in this series, I'm going to show you how to go over grandmaster games yourself and to take some lessons away from them. We're going to be going over the first game from Sindarov's legendary run at the 2026 Candidates. In round 1 of the 2026 Candidates, Javokhir Sindarov played Andrey Esipenko with the white pieces. The game started with d4, d5, c4, e6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, bishop e7, c takes d5, e takes d5, and bishop f4. So grandmasters often have really deep opening prep, and it can be very hard to tell whether the opening is still going or the players are out of book. When you're going over a grandmaster game yourself, what I would recommend to do is to find where you don't know the position and just start reviewing the game from there, not worrying about if the opening is prep or not. For example, let's say you're a 1e4 player instead of d4. Well, we can start reviewing the game from d4 and then go from there. So you would go through each of the moves and try to find a logical conclusion onto why the move is played. If you are a d4 player, maybe there's a line later on in the game that you don't know. For example, after d4, d5, c4, e6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, bishop e7, maybe this c takes d5 move for you is new, and maybe you play something like e3 instead. Well, now you can just start going over the game after c takes d5. So going back to the position, after bishop f4, we have castles, e3, and c5. So one of the most talked about concepts in regards to pawn structure is called an isolated pawn. Now, for those of you who are new, an isolated pawn is simply a pawn that does not have friendly pawns on the files beside it. So they would be the c and e files in this case, and d5 would be an isolated pawn. Now, most of the time people say isolated pawns are bad. And it's true that isolated pawns can be very weak, but the side that has the isolated pawn gets some advantages as well. By definition, isolated pawns have no pawns beside, which means that the files are always open, so the side that has the isolated pawn gets more space. So you're going to notice that d takes c5, bishop takes c5 did not happen in the game, and I just want to say that because a lot of players would say, well, you should play d takes c5, of course, because black gets an isolated pawn, but it's really not that clear cut, and Sindarov decided to play bishop d3 instead. Bishop d3 was also probably the end of Sindarov's prep, or at least specific prep to this game, because he did spend quite a bit of time, maybe 5 or so minutes, on bishop d3. After bishop d3, knight c6 was played, and then we had castles and c4. Now, c4 changes the game completely from a potential isolated pawn position into a closed position. In closed positions, pawn breaks are of the utmost importance, and who can execute their pawn break successfully is generally the side with the strategic advantage. So in this position, we have two potential pawn breaks. One of them is b3, and another is e4. And we're going to want to keep an eye on both. First, we have to pay attention to the fact that our bishop is under attack. So Sindarov played bishop c2. And then comes the sequence knight h5 and bishop e5. And this provokes the sequence f6 and bishop g3. Now, this sequence, in my opinion, is very confusing and difficult to understand. So let's break it down a little bit more. So in this position, after knight to h5, we want to avoid playing e takes f4. For example, let's say we play a move such as a3. Well, after knight takes f4 takes, this on d4 is an isolated pawn, and we don't quite get the same advantages as we saw in the other isolated pawn position. We do have open e file, but black also has open e file as well, and this file is completely blocked. So we don't really have more space. So this is way closer to a straight up liability. Going back to the position, after knight h5, we have two choices. We have bishop e5 and we have bishop g3. So to understand why bishop e5 was played, let's first look at what happens after knight takes e5. So if knight takes e5, white can then follow this up with d takes e5, and not only is d5 attacked now, but this knight on h5 is extremely misplaced and probably going to get trapped. So the knight can't go back to f6, knight can't go to f4, and knight can't go to g3 as well. So this would be much better for us, which means that bishop is immune on e5. So if bishop is allowed to stay on e5, then e5 is objectively a little bit better than g3, because on g3 it controls this diagonal, but on e5 it controls the same exact diagonal plus a little bit of extra space. So this explains why Esipenko decided to play f6, kicking the bishop out, and then we play the move bishop g3. Now, to understand why white wants to provoke f6, we can look at the continuation that comes after bishop g3. So if we play bishop g3, computer suggests knight takes g3, h takes g3, and bishop g4. So this looks about equal, and computer says equal. Okay, so if we go back to here, after we play bishop e5, f6, now bishop g3, if black were to try the same thing, they run into this. So after bishop g4, we play the move queen b1, and this attacks h7. And after g6, we can now see why f6 was nice to provoke, because we can then follow this up with bishop takes g6. So the point is that they can't take back with f-pawn anymore, which means they have to take with h-pawn. And now we have queen h6, which forks king and bishop, and we've got two extra pawns. Using the computer like this is a great strategy if you're trying to learn, and you can figure out why certain continuations weren't played by diving in a little bit deeper. Okay, so going back to the game, we had, once again, f6, bishop g3, and now Esipenko decided to play f5, and we put our bishop back on e5. Now, computer doesn't like this move, but computer and humans play closed positions a little bit differently, so you can kind of ignore it. So we get our bishop back on e5, but black gets something from this as well. So the pawn on f5 is pretty good, because now the square on e4 is guarded by two pawns, which means that e4 break is extremely hard for us to execute. So here, bishop e6 was played, and we execute our only pawn break of b3. Black plays queen a5, attacking our knight. We move our knight, and then black plays b5. So here, this creates a lot of tension in the position between b pawn on b3 and c pawn on c4. Now, tension in chess occurs when two pieces can take each other, and both sides want the other to take. Let's show this. After b takes c4, black can play d takes c4, and this creates a good position for black long term, because they're going to have a passed c pawn, and then eventually, once these pawns move down the board, they're probably going to have passed b pawn as well. Note that we can't play d5 really, because after d5, the move rook d8 appears on the board, and the pawn is pinned to our queen, so we can't really take any one of these pieces. Likewise, if let's say we were to play a move such as h3, if black were to play c takes b3, we play bishop takes b3, this is a good isolated pawn position that we can take advantage of. So black, for the same reasons as we did in earlier, black doesn't really have much more space, because this c file can also be used by us, and this e file is very clogged. So both sides want the other to take, which means that this tension is going to be seen throughout almost the entire game. And one thing that you're going to notice about grandmasters that's very different from the way me and you play is that they keep the tension a lot more. Okay, so after b5, Sindarov decided to play knight f4, and we had knight takes f4, e takes f4, and queen d8. So we did allow this isolated pawn, but this is a little bit different because now the pawn on d4 isn't going to be weak. The bishop on e5 guards it very heavily. There's always going to be a lot of pieces on it, and it's just hard for them to take advantage of this. And then now we can use e-file as well. So he just used his judgment to say, okay, this isolated pawn is not weak. And once again, we're seeing that isolated pawns are not always bad, and you will find exceptions. So don't be super scared of having isolated pawn. So after queen d8, we played rook e1, putting our rook on the open file. Queen d7 was played, and here we're going to try to slowly improve our position so that we can have maximum efficiency of our pieces before eventually playing a4, which is going to break open the position. So this is another thing grandmasters do really well, which is improve the position slowly before going for pawn break. We could go a4 now, but grandmasters most of the time prefer to slowly prepare this, and we play the move rook e3, rook e8, h4, trying to maybe hint at something like knight g5. So black stops it with h6 and g3. G3 is probably the first move that we can consider a serious inaccuracy. As you can see, the computer shows negative 0.5 here. So remember that our goal for studying this game is to play like Sindarov, not to play like the computer. So instead of trying to figure out why G3 is a huge mistake, what we should do is figure out how we can start thinking like Sindarov to think about the move G3 and consider it. So G3 is good for a couple reasons. So it solidifies the pawn structure a little bit, but it's really just an improving move so that we can set up for a4 later by making sure that our king can slide to g2 and not be in the way of back rank. After the move a4, we can see that sometimes maybe a6 will be played, and after some exchanges, a rook coming on the open file, in some lines, they might take our rook on a1, and it will be check, for example. So having the king not on the first row is very helpful in this position. So even though g3 is an inaccuracy, we should still take some lessons from it and figure out how we can start thinking like a grandmaster instead. Esipenko plays a6. We play king g2 like we planned earlier, bishop f7, and here we're going to play the confusing sequence of queen d2, bishop b4, and queen e2. So we're wondering, why would we allow bishop on this diagonal for free? And short answer, it doesn't matter. Computer rates queen d2 and queen e2 the exact same in terms of evaluation. Sindarov probably had some deep calculation and realized that black would probably put the bishop on b6 to attack the somewhat weakened pawn on d4, and he judged that bishop on b6 could be a little bit weak, which did end up happening in the game. Black plays bishop h5 in this position, and we finally execute a4. So we put all our pieces on basically the maximum we could improve them to. So we have double on the e file and king on g2. So we finally execute a4. Black plays bishop a5, and here there is no waiting. Yes, it is very nice if black plays b takes a4, but this is never ever going to happen, so we just open up the a file ourselves. And we play a takes b5, a takes b5, and bishop d1. So bishop d1 is simply an improving move, allowing queen to swing over to a2, as well as protecting the knight with the bishop. Esipenko plays bishop takes f3. We go queen takes f3 and bishop b6, attacking the pawn on d4. Now, this is a mistake, as you can see the computer shows, and the game gets very complex here. So the only way to punish this bishop b6 move is the move rook a6. So how can we find the move rook a6? The first thing that we can note is that the pawn on d4 is attacked by 2 pieces, and we only have 1 defender, so it's the bishop on e5. There's no way for us to protect the pawn another time. A common pitfall that players fall under is trying to delay this capture as long as possible. So I see a lot of people play moves like b takes c4, and after d takes c4, d5, we're delaying it as long as possible. We're relying on a tactic that bishop takes e3, we take the knight, and then we take the bishop. But here, after knight b4, attacking the pawn, our rook is under attack, this pawn is under attack, and we are going to lose the pawn. So instead, we need to look for activity. And it's okay to give up a pawn sometimes if it results in activity. So Sindarov finds the only move, rook a6, because this is active and there are some tactics to support this move. When we analyze rook to a6, we need to look at both captures on d4. So we need to look at knight d4 and we need to look at bishop d4. Bishop d4 is the most natural move to me because it gets out of the way of rook takes b6, but there's a very specific combination that happens here after rook takes c6. So first thing, rook takes c6. If they take our rook, we can take the bishop, and now we have 2 bishops against a rook in terms of material, and that's better for the side with 2 bishops generally. So black can't take our rook, which means they have to do something else. If they take e5, we have this very specific move rook c5 here that keeps everything balanced. So we needed to get our rook out of the way. Here we're attacking the bishop, and then we're also attacking d5 pawn. So if they, for example, play the move bishop d4, we go rook takes d5, attack the bishop, and we gain our pawn back. So material is equal here. We both have 5 pawns. If bishop takes e3, now we go rook c7. This is a nice in-between move. We attack the queen, and then we also attack the bishop. So that's if bishop to d4. Now, knight takes d4 is what happened in the game, and the annoying part about knight takes d4 is it attacks our queen. If we just play something normal, like bishop takes d4, unfortunately, they play bishop takes d4, and now we are down a pawn. We're not really able to get it back. So here, Sindarov finds queen h5, once again the only active move, and this comes with a couple threats. The biggest threat by far is rook takes b6, and if they protect the bishop with something like queen b7, we can go rook b6 anyways, queen b6, bishop d4, hitting the rook on e8. So you can see the queen on h5 really helping out here. Moving the bishop allows a very beautiful combination of rook takes h6. So rook takes h6 is forced mate because rook h8 is threatened. This is checkmate. And if they take the rook, we play queen g6, only move queen g7, and then we play queen takes g7 checkmate. So this is a giant threat in the position. And it's why Esipenko decides to play rook takes e5, which is the only way to survive. Esipenko plays rook takes e5, and after rook takes e5, black is down in exchange, but has a pretty powerful pawn center and 1 pawn for it. One thing grandmasters are also really good at is sacrificing material to gain positional advantages elsewhere. Here, Esipenko needs to protect the bishop, so he plays the move queen c6, which is a mistake. Queen b7 is better, but he probably played queen c6, trying to push c-pawn down the board. We finally release the tension in this position with the move b takes c4, and this is honestly a move that I would never even consider because of the move d takes c4 with check. In this position, Sindarov correctly assesses that after bishop f3, knight takes f3, queen takes f3, queen takes, and king takes. This is a very good position because white is simply up material. The pawn on b5 and the bishop cannot be protected at the same time, and pawn can't even run. So for example, after c3, rook takes b6, c2, we're just in time to catch it with the move rook c6. So instead of d takes c4, b takes c4 was played, and now Sindarov goes bishop a4. Esipenko plays queen to c5, and this creates a very scary threat of creating a huge battery on the diagonal, hitting our f2 pawn. So whenever something is scary in chess, we need to ask ourselves what exactly we're scared of. In this position, it's moving the knight and then letting the queen take the pawn. So here, Sindarov finds a great defense of playing queen g6. So queen g6 hits the bishop. So if the knight moves anywhere that's not on the 6th row, we take the bishop instead. So for example, let's say they play the move knight c2. Well, here we can play queen takes b6, and this solves the problem of queen to b2, or queen f2. If black plays knight c6 here, we can play rook b6, and this creates 2 pieces for a rook exchange, and because we have a bishop, we are up a lot of material, and we're going to win the game. So queen g6 is a great move, stopping what our opponent's going to do, and the biggest lesson that you can take away from this is when your opponent creates a scary threat, you ask yourself exactly what you're scared of instead of panicking and doing something else. Here, Esipenko decides to deal with the threat by moving the bishop to a7, and now we once again need to go fast, because if we don't go fast, they're going to hit us with the same exact threat. So here, we play the move rook to e8, threatening rook f8 immediately. If the queen moves for some reason, let's say they go with their same threat of moving the knight, attacking our pawn on f2, we just go ahead and take the rook. So they say it's a miss because there's a much faster way of winning with rook a7, but I just want to illustrate the point of rook takes f8, because if king takes f8, we checkmate them immediately with queen e8 mate. And if they play queen takes f8, well, then we can take the bishop for free. So this is a very simple way of winning. So rook e8 creates massive threats, which causes Esipenko to play rook takes e8 instead. And now we play queen takes e8. Here, Esipenko plays king h7. And this is straightforward calculation. We go queen g6, king h8, bishop d7, c3. And this sets up the unstoppable threat of rook e6. So Sindarov repeated moves a couple times to reach move 40, and then played rook e6, and the game ended. So just to illustrate what's going to happen, this creates the unstoppable threat of rook e8. So if black were to play something like c2, we go rook e8, and then take like this, and that's checkmate. So if they take our rook instead, well, here we go bishop e6, attacking the king. If they play king f8, we have queen f7 checkmate. And if king h8, we have the pattern of queen e8, bishop g8, bishop f7, and queen g8. So that would be checkmate. Hopefully this game analysis was helpful, and I will see you in the next episode.